Susan Swanky. I'm also on staff here at Upper House in the foundation. When we were doing this lecture series, I kept telling Tony, we got to get this guy, Jeffrey Ludwig. He's really good at speaking about archaeology in a really fascinating and exciting way. And I was trying to remember, we were talking about this at dinner. The first time I heard him speak was in 2017 at an event called Theology on Tap. So a local church offered these talks on different topics of faith, and we had it at a local bar. And I think of all the Theology on Tap speakers I heard, I enjoyed Jeffrey's the most. He knew so much, but he was also just such a happy guy and loved to share these exciting details about the world that God's created. So I think you'll also appreciate his exuberance tonight. So let me give you his official introduction. An active field researcher, Jeffrey is co-director of archaeological excavations at Tel El-Hesi in Israel. This was occupied 2800 BC through the Persian period, which he'll give you a little more background on that. His interests include early Canaanite trade and technology, the cultural world of the patriarchs, the Iron Age kingdom of Judah, and the Old Testament period generally. He earned his PhD in archaeology with an emphasis in Hebrew and Semitic studies from the University of Madison, Wisconsin in 2018, and is the author of numerous articles and book chapters on biblical and Mediterranean archaeology. Jeffrey is also an instructor at St. Ambrose Academy here in Madison and a research fellow at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Cobb Institute of Archaeology at Mississippi State University. And he's also just shared with us, he's added to his responsibilities adjunct professor at Holy Apostles Seminary. Jeffrey lives here in Madison with his wife and his 11-month-old son. Please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Ludwig.
All right. Thank you very much for that overwhelming welcome. Hopefully I live up to your expectations. Everyone hear me okay? Okay, perfect. Well, the introductions are done. Before I get started any more with the actual talk, it is typical in my profession to make just a brief mention of all of the individuals that make archaeological research possible. The institutions that supply funding, the colleagues that particularly assist me, my former dissertation advisors who continue to help me with my work, one of whom is in the audience. Please don't revoke my PhD. But seriously, archaeology is a very collaborative discipline. We rely on our funding and we rely on each other. So thank you very much to all of the individuals and institutions listed on this slide who have made the research that I've been able to embark on in the biblical world possible. We already had a brief introduction to who I am. I just wanted to mention the most important thing in my life, which is my family. So there's my lovely wife wearing the archaeology hat, and my 11-month-old getting a lecture on stratification in a state park. So the work that I've done has spanned numerous periods, numerous regions, and hopefully by the end of the lecture today, I'm able to impart just a little bit of an interest, a curiosity into archaeology and its relationship with the Bible more generally. How this is going to break down, I have a very brief introduction to the problem. We have this big question: does archaeology contradict the Bible? Has archaeology disproven insert X, Y, or Z? I'll introduce that a little bit, and then we'll go through a series of case studies. Each of those will be the 30 minutes, questions, and then I'll say a few things. I'll go off just straight away to try to deflate the expectation. I am not going to solve this problem, right? It's not going to go away. It is a challenging question, and one night lecture series, I'm not going to pretend that I have all of the answers perfectly figured out. My hope is to give you a perspective on this in such a way that your intellectual curiosity is piqued and the conversation can continue. So what exactly is the problem? Well, we have the Bible, right? The Bible is one of the most famous books in history. I think it goes without much introduction. And at its essence, the scriptures recount a story that is set in history, right? For Judaism, for Christianity, and for Islam, there are historical realities that are present and presented to the readers, or originally the listeners, to the narratives in the Old Testament. And so a question as old as the Bible itself is, did this actually happen? It does matter to Christians, to Muslims, to Jews, all over the world, whether or not the stories of the Bible are pure myth, whether they are partially true, or whether there is a historical core, a solid historical foundation for the Christian faith. This is important both to individuals. It's certainly important to various churches, apologetics efforts, and so the question is a very real one. I mean, in my own life, trying to come to grips with how archaeology, how science, and the scriptures relate was a very challenging time for me as a young man. I almost lost my faith over the issue, right? I'm still Christian. I am a practicing Roman Catholic, and so I should share that off the bat. My perspective is one rooted in a particular Christian tradition. I'm doing the best that I possibly can to speak in such a way, not to offend any denomination, but I think it's worthy to go off the bat and just sort of share what my own perspective with this is. I've given a definition of the Bible, if you would like one. It is a collection of sacred texts of various genres written by ancient Israelite authors, believed by Jews and Christians to have been written under the charism of divine inspiration. So really, why there is a question at all regarding the historical claims in the Bible, why it even matters in the first place. Very many Christian denominations, I'd venture to guess most of them, really center around two doctrines regarding sacred scripture. And that is the doctrine of divine inspiration and the question of error. Are there errors in scripture? Is scripture inspired by God? Right? And so the two questions together make for a challenge for biblical archaeology, right? Because if archaeology can demonstrate conclusively that, say, David and Solomon did not exist, that poses major theological issues for Christians of all denominations, Jews of all denominations to grapple with, right? And so the question becomes, right, are there errors in Scripture? Do what we find through science contradict what we see in the pages of Scripture? So as we get started, I think it's worthwhile to share my own position. What is sort of the perspective I am looking at this with? And my position is that archaeology neither confirms nor denies the validity of the stories recorded in the Bible. It may sound like a cop-out answer. I promise you it is not. Archaeology as a discipline, what is it? Is a method. Archaeology is a method for discovering material remains, right? We are trying to recover largely artifacts and architecture to reconstruct past life ways and behavior based on this material empirical evidence. It cannot provide definitive proof or disproof. Absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, vice versa. I'm sure you're familiar with this concept. It is my conviction that at best, biblical archaeology can demonstrate that certain narratives, certain events are historically plausible. That is, they likely have a historical core, taking into account the genre of the biblical text, the genre of the narrative involved, and the accuracy of later traditions, editorial glosses, and such. So this really, my position with this, I hope doesn't come across as too lame, right? I don't want people to be like, oh man, you're running from the question. But I think it is very, very vital to approach this not as a archaeology versus the Bible or archaeology equals the Bible. Ultimately, theological faith cannot be replaced by archaeology, right? And archaeology, that said, can help bolster one's faith. And hopefully, as we look at tonight, by illustrating and illuminating the context of these narratives, I think that at least in the three cases that I've chosen to discuss tonight, archaeology can shed a great deal of light on the Old Testament narratives that renders what is presented historically plausible. And as a scientist, as an archaeologist, that is the best that I'm able to offer. So without any further ado, I will give you one example of the difficulties that can be faced when you're dealing with questions of archaeology contradicting the Old Testament, and that is the question of camels. All right, so this is a case study you may not have given much thought to. I am well known at my high school for hating camels. It's a long story. I don't really have that much beef with them, but in terms of the Old Testament, particularly if you look at the narratives of Abraham, for example. Abraham is said to have camels among the flocks and herds that he possesses. One of the issues that potentially is confronting this story is current evidence for the domestication of the dromedary puts the date of its domestication about 1000 BC, give or take. If you look at the chronology the Bible itself presents, Abraham should be around, alive and kicking around 1900, 1800 BC. What do we make of this? Did the scriptural author just straight up lie and just make up these camels? And if he made up the camels, did he make up anything else, right? No camels, no covenant. Is that the approach that one should take? Or are camels simply a gloss for the wealth of Abraham and his identity as a desert wanderer, a pastoral nomad living on the fringes of society among the later Iron Age peoples? These sorts of folk were attributed to camels. If you were living in the desert, you're a wanderer, you're a wealthy wanderer, you have camels. Is it something like that? So that's a challenge. Again, I don't have all of the answers for it, but at least personally, the idea regarding the plausibility of Abraham being a very wealthy merchant, how would that sound to someone in the Iron Age when the biblical texts are actually written down? It would almost be an insult to say such a person did not have camels amongst their wealth. So there's just one example. As we begin, a brief, and I mean brief review of the paradigm of research in the Holy Land, right? So how do we get to a discipline of archaeology that can actually investigate these questions? So really, there's four epochs, four paradigms of research into the Holy Land that I'd run through real quick. Theology, right? The predominant research paradigm from 1000 BC, or even all the way up to present, primary interest in this part of the world is largely, for very many people, it is theological in nature, right? The Holy Land is not just any other place on the map, it is the place of sacred narratives, right? This gives way, especially in the 1800s among Protestant traditions, to a biblical geography, right? This itself blossoms into biblical archaeology, which is to some extent still present, though there are those who have attempted to distance themselves from biblical archaeology and have sort of adopted the title of Near Eastern archaeology, looking at the biblical world more broadly as opposed to just Palestine and Israel, taking the scope larger. Objectives and limitations, I think, is a reasonable thing to think about at this stage. When we're going into the paradigms, what can I do, what can I not do? Well, in terms of how we get to modern excavations, first you need to locate a site. This is where the earlier foundations of biblical geography were quite useful. Right, I'll mention a very quick history of that in a moment. But the excavations of modern sites are very time-intensive, and at best, we're maybe getting a quarter of an ancient site excavated. Right, so keep that in mind as we try to draw conclusions as best we can. We don't have perfect knowledge. We also only are able to study things that leave a material empirical remain, right? So if there were papyrus documents at a particular site that disintegrated, we would not find them. So bear that in mind as we consider the case studies. We don't know what we don't have. We don't know what we've lost. And so archaeology can tell us a great deal, but it cannot tell us everything, right? How we got to where we are today, right? This is Edward Robinson, the father of biblical geography, right? So his great observation in his travels around the Holy Land in the 1830s is that there is preserved in modern Arabic place names that he's observing throughout the Palestinian landscape, biblical site names, right? And this really helps kick into high gear the academic study of the Holy Land as land, right? It is advanced into the study of the Holy Land as a cultural landscape, largely by the work of William Matthew Flinders Petrie at the dig site that I currently work at, Tel El Hesi. There's Flinders Petrie. And his colleague who succeeded him in excavating Tel El Hesi, Frederick Jones Bliss. Tel El Hesi is the earliest recorded archaeological excavation in the Holy Land, systematic and scientific in nature. With Petrie, with Bliss, and with subsequent archaeologists, the great insight is that the mounds of the Holy Land have sequences of material culture, one layered on top of the next, on top of the next, on top of the next. And so that as you dig down through these artificial mounds on the landscape, you are actually moving through cultural levels, right? So that the deeper down you dig, the older the materials you get. Right? that is a very, very quick introduction to what archaeology is, some of the problems. But I want to leave ample time to dive into this case study about the patriarchs, the Amorites, and the Hyksos. So what can archaeology illuminate about the biblical account of Abraham, the patriarchs, right? So who is Abraham? All right, the book of Genesis, right? He is this man from Ur who travels with his family up into Haran in northern Syria, where he receives a call from God to inherit the promised land of Canaan, moves down into that area, has more adventures, ultimately does have a son named Isaac. Right, the narrative continues on from there with the children of Isaac, the children of Jacob, becoming the 12 tribes Israel. Well, where are we dealing? Where is Canaan? Where is Ur? These are places that have been identified, right, at least tentatively. Ur of the Chaldees was identified as the location you see marked here in southern modern-day Iraq. Canaan, largely Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, and Jordan. What I'm going to spend the remainder of my time in this first lecture looking at is the context of the Middle Bronze Age. What is the Middle Bronze Age? Well, why study this? Most scholars who accept a historical core to the narratives of the patriarchs would cite the most plausible setting as sometime in the Middle Bronze 2A through 2B C, if you want specifics. Generally between 2000 and 1550 BC is seen as the most plausible setting. Well, I have about 18 minutes to explore why. The site of Ur is sort of the first clue in this. The city of Ur was excavated by Carl Leonard Woolley, a colleague of Lawrence of Arabia, for those who know the epic film. Ur is a very prosperous and powerful city-state of the Sumerians, with extensive trade connections reaching as far as India. Its hegemony ends in Ur III period, followed by a period of occupation by outsiders known as Amorites. Here you have an image of one of the attendants of one of the queens of Ur, interred with her at her death. This period, the Middle Bronze Age in Mesopotamia, may be referred to as the Age of the Amorites. Amorites is a particular name, the Amuru. They are Semitic-speaking tribes that are located at the fringes of the Mesopotamian world. And during the Middle Bronze Age, these groups are recorded as having a more or less hostile relationship with the city-states settled in Sumeria, Akkad, Assyria, and they more or less create their own Middle Bronze Age 2 kingdoms throughout the Near East. In Canaan, what we see is a shift in settlement pattern and a revolution in material culture. So what Canaan looks like prior to the Middle Bronze Age is a different system altogether. That was the period studied in my doctoral dissertation called the Intermediate Bronze Age. So the earliest cities in Canaan arise around 3000 BC. They continue until about 2500 BC. So about 500 years, you have the first city-states develop in this part of the world. Well, following 2500 BC, there's major climatic shifts, there's major social pressure shifts that cause people in Canaan to abandon city life altogether, except in a very few regions where rainfall made agriculture possible. So the pattern of life that you see is a disintegration of city-states and a rise of either pastoral nomads or small tribal villages. Out of this system, in the Middle Bronze Age, you see an explosion and the arising of true city-states all over Canaan. There's an increase in sites, there's an increase in size of sites. New pottery is invented, particularly the use of a fast wheel. So these technological developments fuel a cultural development within Canaan that bring it into a world well beyond its own borders. For example, the construction of architecture in the form of city gates is widely shared between sites in Israel, as well as sites as far north as Alalak, Turkey. And so there is a sphere of similarly practicing cultures, largely grouped into the concept of Amorites or Amorite-affiliated peoples. A clear example of this may be seen at the biblical site of Dan, the northernmost site in biblical Israel. I draw your attention to the Middle Bronze Age gate at this tell. It's one of the best preserved gate complexes anywhere in the Middle East, and particularly in the Holy Land. And what you see is a monumental architecture at these sites dedicated to defense. So someone powerful is living in these sites, and what they have is worth defending. What they have is probably prime trade networks. What makes me say that the Canaanites of the Middle Bronze Age are particularly interested in trade, especially trade north with Syria? Right? Where I'm going with this, why does it matter that Canaan is connected to Syria and Syria connected to Mesopotamia? If you look at the narrative of the progression of the patriarchs, they start in Sumeria, southern Mesopotamia, they end up in Syria, and ultimately they end in Canaan. That pattern of movement is something that we see during this period, the pattern of material culture, as well as the pattern of legal texts, which we'll talk about in a moment. But a paradigmatic example of one of these Middle Bronze Age Canaanite city-states is the very famous site of Tel Megiddo. Right, and I share one particular case study from Tel Megiddo that I think illustrates really well the connectivity of the Middle Bronze Age Canaanite, widely spread Semitic-speaking world, and that is Tomb 50. Right, so creatively named, right, Tomb 50. This is relatively recent excavation from about 2018 is when it was discovered, and it dates a little later, the Middle Bronze Age 3, 2C if that's your thing. But it is the burial of a potential royal family at the site. It was very exciting when it was discovered. Extraordinarily wealthy grave that had not been looted. This was super exciting when something like this was excavated. And it was excavated in such a way, so carefully, that the contents of ceramic vessels were able to be analyzed. In terms of who was interred here, you had a male, who seemed to be the primary burial, a female in her mid-30s, and then a young girl somewhere between 8 and 10. There was also sort of off to the side just a bone heap of 6 other people. So don't know quite what's going on there, but I think it's pretty clear, at least what archaeologists are reconstructing here. You have your royal family and the other folks, right? What's present in this? Well, what makes me really want to talk about this site is I think it has some of the best evidence for complex trade relations, showing these connections that Canaanite city-states had of any site. Well, they tested one of the ceramic jugs, and it actually came back with evidence for the presence of vanilla. Right? It was the earliest documented use of vanilla in the Old World. Prior to the discovery of this, it was thought that vanilla was primarily introduced into Europe from New World sources. Right? Its origins have been hypothesized as either orchids in India, Sri Lanka, or Eastern Africa. Bottom line, whoever these individuals were at Megiddo, a Canaanite site, they were well connected and wealthy enough to afford extremely luxurious commodities traded over incredible distances at this period. My own dissertation research looked at the jewelry of similar sites during the preceding Middle Bronze Age 1 or Intermediate Bronze Age period. And the connection to Sri Lanka, India, Megiddo was interesting to me because the carnelian beads, carnelian is this red, beautiful stone, these carnelian beads found in the preceding period actually also showed connections to India. Drilling of beads is something that can be accomplished in numerous different ways, but particular drills are indicative of particular technological traditions, styles, right? Different styles for different cultures is something that has been noted by archaeologists. And this collection of about 54 beads, which is a pretty sizable sample from the few tombs that we had that actually had jewelry from this period, they seem to have been made using technology that has been previously documented in the Indus Valley civilization of Pakistan. So the presence of 54 artifacts out of 214 present in Israel that were made in the Indus Valley, most likely, shows a great connection from India into the Levant. There's a pattern that also emerged in these studies that show that our Levantine individuals accessing beads associated with the Indus were not alone. Each of the regions that I've circled here have also found beads that are associated with the Indus Valley of Pakistan and India. So whoever was living in sites like Megiddo, like Tel Beit Dagon in Israel, these individuals were connected to larger trade networks, larger worlds that saw individuals importing and moving with these objects. A good case study to consider here also, the possibility of identifying migrants. Right? This particular tomb at the site of Dagon, Tel Beit Dagon in Israel, was the burial of a single female individual who was buried with some pottery, but notably, she was buried with this necklace of carnelian beads. It turns out that 100% of the beads on her necklace were made in the Indus style of jewelry. I'm not arguing this individual is concrete proof of someone that moved from India to Israel in this period, because this particular style of bead was very popular in Mesopotamia as well. So is it possible that we have evidence not just of the trade of objects, but also the movement of people? That is something to consider during this period, and this may well be an instance of the movement of these human peoples carrying beads associated with different traditions. For the final little segment here, I want to talk about the Hyksos. Who are the Hyksos and how do they relate to the study of the patriarchs? So previously, the evidence we have from Canaan, well, if you look at the story of Abraham, they're not actually living in cities. All right, they are moving between locations. They're pastoral nomads, but the site is northern Egypt is what I'd like to draw your attention to in this phenomenon called the Hyksos. Who are the Hyksos? Well, according to Josephus, ancient Jewish historian, who gets information from other individuals who got their information from a 3rd century BC Egyptian priest, there is a group of individuals from the Levant who invade northern Egypt and conquer it. Josephus identifies these individuals as the Israelites. And so that's an interesting question. Who are these Hyksos? It's a version of an Egyptian name, rulers of foreign lands. Their origins are quite debatable. Are they invaders? Are they infiltrators? Are they local? Current opinion seems to be that it's a mix. The Hyksos are not just this race of barbarians who come in and sweep away the kingdom of northern Egypt. They seem to be a coalition of migrants. It is indisputable that the Hyksos leave their mark on Egyptian history. They're one of the few outside powers sufficiently powerful to conquer half of Egypt. They conquer most of Lower Egypt. They introduce the chariot as a weapon of war in Egypt, and they have very distinctive axe heads. We actually have a skull of a pharaoh, a mummified skull, which appears to have been killed by a Hyksos battle axe. You see precisely the same wound in the head of this pharaoh, which was a big deal, seeing as pharaoh is supposedly a living god. I don't think the Egyptians took too kindly to the assassination of one of their leaders. So the Hyksos are not popular in Egyptian literature. Their immigration is actually wonderfully illustrated on a tomb painting from the site of Beni Hassan. It's called the Delegation of the Aamu. It's a processional wall painting indicating the movement of individuals about 1800 BC into Egypt. They are labeled by hieroglyphics as coming from Canaan, particularly from the Transjordan, or just to the east of the Dead Sea, basically the area that would become biblical Moab. Who are these guys? Well, some of them are labeled, right? Abishah the Hyksos is the name of the leader. My father is king, is what his name translates to, and this is interesting. It raises some eyebrows because it seems to be a sort of a similar name to Abishai, who is an individual mentioned in the Old Testament. It's an Old Testament Hebrew name. This individual is noted as the leaders. He seems to be leading a group of migrants, presenting their offerings to an Egyptian official, and I want to point out the coat that he is wearing. One of the best insights we have into material culture at this time is this painting. We can actually see how these individuals from Canaan during the Middle Bronze Age looked. And he is wearing a long-sleeved tunic, a tunic of many colors. He is displaying his status using textiles. I'm pretty deliberate in my choice of coat of many colors. Is this a possible connection to a contextualizing clue to the identity of the narrative of Joseph and the movement of the Israelites under Jacob into the Egyptian delta? You have additional individuals who are labeled here, ultimately presenting their case for entry into Egypt, right? Carrying different weapons, carrying tools with their women and children. This isn't a military expedition, in other words, right? Even from the artistic insights of Egyptian canon, you're not dealing with a straight invasion. You're dealing with a migration of families into the area, right? And that seems like a strong indication of who the Hyksos are. You see evidence of cultural mixing. Egypt has a particularly strong gravitational pull in terms of Egyptian culture. Once the Hyksos emerge as a political phenomenon, they begin adopting Egyptian habits, dress, and names remarkably quickly, right? So you see Hyksos kings, right, named using Egyptian hieroglyphics, right? Adopting even Egyptian statues and reusing them, reinscribing Egyptian artifacts. You have depictions of the great mushroom-headed hairstyle developing among officials of this time. But what I think the most fascinating recent study into the origins of the Hyksos is actually looking at strontium isotopes. So strontium is something that is found everywhere in the environment through drinking water. It's coming from bedrock. You are drinking it literally. And if you study in bones, it's very difficult to have preservation of the quality to do this, but it can be done. And when you can do it, you can note a change in whether you are drinking the same water throughout your life as your teeth are developing. You're typically taking samples from teeth. Are you using the same groundwater throughout that period, or has there been a movement at some point in your life? Right. So in other words, does the strontium you're taking up from groundwater match the area where you were buried? Right, because that early childhood is when your teeth are forming, your big adult teeth. That's what you're seeing in this study. And so you have all of these isotope values taken from the Hyksos capital at Tel Adaba, Avaris. You can see the two different values. There's people born outside of Egypt, people born in Egypt. Results of this particular scientific paper shows that there's actually more immigrants arriving in this area that is outside the normal level of Egyptian groundwater just before the Hyksos. The most interesting pattern to me is that more females, more women, are actually non-local than men. So there were more men in the area who were local to the area compared to the women, right? And they see that emphasize. So what is this? What does this all mean in terms of its analysis? You have the movement of foreign elite women. If you look at the burials, these were not poor peasant farmers. Foreign elite women are moving in, and local men are staying put. This seems to be a pattern of marriage exchange, right, where you have patrilocal individuals sending elsewhere to bring wives to themselves. This is a reasonable parallel to the activity we would even see in the book of Genesis, right? Where does Abraham seek a wife for his son, Isaac? He seeks a wife among their kin elsewhere. And so this sort of movement is not unprecedented during the Middle Bronze Age. What happens among the Hyksos is the development of a full-fledged urban society, right? In Avaris would be their central location. But my own work has looked at some of the beads of this particular culture. And something that I've noted that is quite interesting is a similar tradition of manufacture is noted, similar styles, similar types of drills, similar patterns of wear for beads throughout Canaan, right? As well as throughout the Middle East more broadly. So particular styles are found in Israel that appear to be made at sites up in Turkey. So there's a wide variety of these particular stones in circulation that seem to image a society that is connected from Egypt all the way up into Turkey. And so the question that I leave this segment with, have we found parallels to Joseph in Egypt, right? Is this evidence of the movement of the patriarchs into the area? And ultimately, what we can say, the Hyksos period appears, at least in my opinion, to be the most fitting historical setting for this particular narrative of the patriarchs. Really, the Hyksos period is what tells me a firm chronological anchor from which to date back the other patriarchs. That is at least my opinion, right? Others may disagree with me. They're free to do so, but based on the evidence at hand and based on the conviction that there are historical cores, there's real history behind these narratives, this appears to be the most plausible time when a slave from Palestine could actually work their way up to the chancellor of Egypt. Why would you be able to do that? Well, the pharaoh himself is a fellow Semitic-speaking Canaanite. Right? So it seems to be a period that is best. Have we proved it definitively? No, but I think you at least have enough evidence to chew on that, to me, indicates this really is a sound historical parallel. And what happens after? What happens after the Joseph narrative? Right, that's the end of Genesis. You turn the page, you're in Exodus. Everything's fine for like a paragraph, and then it's not. Right? Well, the Hyksos are defeated in 1550 BC by local Egyptians. Right? They storm back through Avaris, they reconquer their territory, and they keep going into Palestine. Right? They solidify Egyptian control over the entire region. And what would that mean for Hyksos allies left behind in the Nile Delta? Well, you were friends with the people that murdered the god king of Egypt. They're probably not going to be too happy with you. So is that a plausible account of how Hebrews would go from living pretty large, right? If one of your guys is the chancellor of Egypt, to slaves. This has been considered by many archaeologists who accept this historical core to the story as a reasonable context for the Exodus narratives themselves. 1 second. All right.